Hey there, it is Saturday, so it's movie night, and I'm here to present another quarantine quadruple feature for your viewing pleasure. My name is Paul, and I have just finished my 30th week of quarantine, if you can believe it. 30 weeks this has been going on. And to celebrate the occasion of getting to the big 3-0, I wanted a very special topic tonight, or at least a topic that I am very interested in. So we're going to geek out quite a bit for a certain subgenre of horror. I wanted to keep the theme horror for October, and this week will be very similar to, if you remember the quarantine quadruple feature I did on queer horror, the history of queer horror, that was back in like week 14 or something like that. This one's going to be kind of a similar deep dive where I recommend and discuss a lot of movies, but of course, as always, we're only going to be watching 4 movies tonight. But we are going to go chronological, and I'm just going to talk about a lot of different types of meta horror as we examine the evolution of meta horror. So something that's meta is basically just something that is commenting on itself. It's aware of itself. It's commenting on the tropes of the genre or something like that. Probably the most famous example in horror, you can see right here. So meta horror films, I would say from 1990 to 2011 is when the bulk of them came out. We're going to be going all the way back to 1960 to discuss these, and we're going to stop around 2015 is where I'm going to stop. In the past 5 years, there have been a glut of meta horror films. It's just very in vogue and popular to have your characters be aware of the tropes in horror films now. You know, a little like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. People keep kind of trying to top the previous meta horror films, but we've sort of reached a point where they're not really getting better. So we're just going to kind of cap it at 2015, but we're going to start all the way back in 1960 for what I would argue is probably the first meta horror film is Michael Powell's Peeping Tom from 1960. Peeping Tom is a very important film for a few reasons. One, it's one of the precursors to slasher films. 1960 gave us Peeping Tom, which was a British film, as well as Psycho, which was an American film by a British filmmaker. Those two movies were very pivotal in what ultimately became the slasher movie genre. And while Black Christmas by Bob Clark is often credited as the first film to put the viewer in the POV of the serial killer, it was actually Peeping Tom several years before that. So Peeping Tom, it's about a cameraman. He actually works on film shoots, and he has a little camera that he films, and he starts filming girls that he likes, and they enjoy being photographed, and his camera's on a tripod. In the third leg, he raises it up, and he pulls the leg off the end, and there's a knife on it. So he actually films himself jamming the tripod stake into people so he can film them as he murders them. So it's pretty twisted, and it was actually a movie that led to the downfall of Michael Powell's career. It was so controversial when it came out because people were so offended by the film. But I would say that was probably the first meta horror film. It was aware of itself, and it was even about the act of filming and filmmaking. After Peeping Tom, I don't really think there's too much meta horror going on for a really long time, until 1975, when arguably one of the most important meta horror films that's ever been made came out. And this one was really pivotal in skewering horror, science fiction, musicals. It's the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The movie is brilliant, with a tour de force performance by Tim Curry, one of my favorite actors. He's amazing in this movie. This one is totally aware of all of the tropes of horror and sci-fi. In fact, the opening number, sung by just a big mouth, is science fiction double feature. So it's all about 50s B horror and sci-fi movies, and it kind of uses all those tropes within the film and is kind of commenting on all of those types of movies as well, while making a very fun and engaging movie. The 80s is where it starts to become a lot more common to start commenting on horror films within your horror film. Student Bodies came out in 1981, and you can kind of think of that like a really early precursor to something like Scary Movie. That one's not really even a horror movie, it's just a straight up slapstick comedy. 1980 also gave us Effects, which was a movie about a low-budget independent horror film where cast and crew were getting murdered in real life. The 80s gave us a handful that touch on being meta horror films without being all out meta horror films. We've actually watched several of these movies, so I'm just going to quickly gloss over all of the movies that we've already watched in our quadruple features. Now, we did not watch The Howling yet, but in 1981, Joe Dante made The Howling, and that movie is referencing previous werewolf movies that have come before it, particularly The Wolfman from Universal. They know the rules of what's going to happen with the werewolves because of movies. This one doesn't really go too crazy meta. It doesn't really beat you over the head with it. They just kind of reference other horror films. And then some of the movies we've actually watched in previous quadruple features, these span from the 80s to the very early 90s. Night of the Comet is very aware of itself and the tropes of apocalypse zombie movies. Fright Night is very aware of itself and the tropes of vampire movies. Demons, which I talked about a few weeks ago when we actually watched Popcorn. Both of these movies are horror films that are set in movie theaters where horror films are screening, and the things that you're seeing on the screens are kind of precursors to what's about to happen in the actual movie that you're watching. So all of those are meta horror films as well. 1983, it's not a movie, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention Michael Jackson's Thriller, which, starts with Michael Jackson watching a movie on a date, and then as they leave the movie because his date is scared, it turns into a horror movie, and it's different types of horror movies. It's a zombie movie, it's a werewolf movie, and there's kind of a lot of awareness of the genre that's going on, which is obviously a ton of fun as well. Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. This was the first Jason movie that slipped into meta territory. It was aware of itself. It was poking fun at the tropes of the Friday the 13th and slasher movies. Yeah, so Jason Lives came out in 86, and it was the first of the Friday the 13th movies to actually be self-aware. We're going to talk about a lot of Friday the 13th movies next month, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that one. Okay, Monster Squad from 1987. This one is kind of a horror mashup of all of the Universal monster movies. This movie is working off of the idea that all of the kids in the movie are aware of all of these monster movies that have come out, and they know all of the rules for killing certain monsters. I really love the Monster Squad. If you haven't seen it, you really got to see it. I find that there's like two types of people that grew up in the 80s. Those that are obsessed with the Goonies and those that were obsessed with Monster Squad. And I was definitely a Monster Squad kid. 1988 horror film, Waxwork, had an awareness of all of these previous monster movies that have come before it as well. Unmasked Part 25. This came out in 88 or 89. This was a British horror film that's a send-up of the sort of Friday the 13th type films, so that the title is a joke as well. Unmasked Part 25. There's not parts 21 through 24, but it's just commenting on how these franchises just start cracking out the sequels one right after another. And this is a really bizarre little film. It's more introspective, and it's as if Jason Voorhees had the soul of a poet and was walking around questioning why he's killing people, why life is the way it is. And it's sort of funny in a very dry British way, but it's more interesting than anything. It's not really that scary. There's some pretty good kills, but it's a really wacky one. Okay, so that does it for the 80s. Again, most of them aren't really that crazy, in-depth meta horror. That really, I feel like, kicks off from the 90s. That's when we really start getting commentaries on horror films. Oh, I should mention the horror films that I'm choosing for this quadruple feature, I'm choosing because they're specifically about making horror films as well. It's not just a commentary on horror films, like something like Funny Games or Scream. It's the plotline is literally about making horror films, with the exception of one movie, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And this movie from 1990 is the first film that we're actually watching for our quadruple feature. And this is Lucio Fulci's Cat in the Brain. Now, I don't think Cat in the Brain is an exceptional film by any stretch of the imagination, but it is an entertaining film and it is a fascinating film. This is very late in Lucio Fulci's career. He had a very impressive horror career that spanned many, many years, and he made dozens of films. Some of the most influential Italian horror films that have ever been made were made by this guy. This is one of his last few films. He made like 3 or 4 movies after this, I think. This is his last really noteworthy film. And the reason this movie is sort of interesting and sort of groundbreaking is a lot of the movie is recycled material. A lot of it is murder sequences and bizarre horror scenes from other films that he didn't use. So it's a bunch of scrapped material that he Frankenstein cobbles into a movie, and then he films new material to link it all together. And the material that he films for the movie, Cat in the Brain, is about a filmmaker, Lucio Fulci. He's playing himself in the movie, and he's going to a therapist because he's had a whole life of making horror films, and he thinks it's driving him crazy, and he has all of these hallucinations and these dreams, and those are the sequences from the previously made horror films, the cut sequences. He starts plunging deeper and deeper into insanity and wondering if he's going to become a killer. So it's very gory, it's very bizarre, it's really experimental, and this is the first one we're going to watch because I think this is really important for opening the world of really exploring the genre within the film. I think this was the first one to really blow up a horror movie and root around through all of the bloody bits. So first film we're going to be watching in our quadruple feature is Lucio Fulci's Cat in the Brain. And then we're going straight to our second movie that we're going to be watching. We're going to jump up 4 years to 1994. And this is basically a much better exploration of what Lucio Fulci was trying to do with Cat in the Brain, but done to a much more professional degree. It is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I absolutely love Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and I think it is one of the best films that he made. So if you're not familiar with the Nightmare on Elm Street series, Wes Craven made A Nightmare on Elm Street in the 80s, and then he did not make any of the other Nightmare on Elm Street movies. And then they had Part 6, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, where they definitively kill off Freddy. And then a few years later, Wes Craven brings him back. So how are you going to bring off a character that the franchise said, we are officially killing him, we're killing him right in the title? So this movie is actually about Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy in the original Nightmare on Elm Street and in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors. She was the original final girl in that movie. She's playing herself in the film as a film actress who played Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street. So she's an adult now, she has a kid, and all of these crazy things are happening in her life. And Wes Craven reaches out to her and he says, hey, I'm writing a new Freddy movie and I want you to star in it. So basically the further that Wes Craven gets in the screenplay, the more that Freddy Krueger starts to become a reality and starts killing people in the real world. So the movie's sort of a trip. It's also about fairy tales, the act of storytelling, and the cathartic, powerful effect that telling stories has on people, and how we have to kind of get evil out of our lives by telling stories about it. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare make a phenomenal trilogy. I think all three of those movies work really well together. But this movie is one of the most meta horror films ever made. Yes, even more so than Scream, which he would go on to do a couple years later. This really laid the groundwork for what Scream was able to do. This doesn't get as much love as Scream, but I think it's absolutely a brilliant, brilliant film. This is number 2. Let's jump up to 1996 for the Scream franchise. The first one came out in 1996. Now, I actually don't find Scream as satisfyingly meta as a lot of the other meta horror films that have come out. I mean, it talks about horror films. They are a bunch of teenagers who live in a world where horror films exist, and they know the tropes of the slasher genre, and the movie sort of follows those tropes and spins some of them on their heads, and it's very clever. The great thing about Scream is that it's just like a really top-notch slasher movie, really one of the greatest slasher movies ever made, and I really like all 4 of them. I thought Wes Craven did a great job with all of them. So as far as meta horror goes, I find Wes Craven's New Nightmare to be more satisfying and way more thought-provoking in that regard, but Scream's a masterpiece. Can't fault that one. It's a really great movie and great meta horror, and I feel like it's simple enough of a concept to not really turn people off. It's not full-blown crazy like something like Cat in the Brain or Wes Craven's New Nightmare, but I like full-blown crazy. Okay, now we're actually going to wrap the 90s up with a movie from 1997, Michael Haneke's Funny Games, which he actually went and remade in 2007. Funny Games is sort of a funny meta commentary on horror films, and the reason he made the movie, which I think is is a bit pretentious, but I actually really like the film, is he thought horror films in the 90s were so disgusting and vile and violent and joyfully murdering people and disemboweling them. He thought something was wrong with American films. He was looking at our country from across the ocean, and he thought something was wrong with Americans for reveling in these totally violent films, and maybe there is. So he made Funny Games as a commentary on American horror films. So this is a home invasion movie where a couple really weird kids walk over to a neighbor's house and start talking with them, and then start kind of pushing their buttons a little more. Oh, can we borrow some eggs? And then she gives them some eggs, and then he drops them on the ground. Oh, I'm so sorry, they just fell out of my hand. Can I have a couple more eggs? You just dropped those eggs. I didn't mean to. Gives them some more eggs, he drops them on the ground, and then they just won't leave the house. And of course it escalates and it gets more and more violent. But the movie is very aware of itself, and it breaks the fourth wall where, you know, one of the serial killers will like turn and look right at the camera and say some quippy thing or wink or something. They also even at one point reverse time. And when I saw it in 1997, it was a very powerful movie. I thought it really affected me and frightened me and entertained me and made me think about storytelling and how you can really do whatever you want in storytelling. 2007 version that he made, this one's actually in English. This did not have the same effect because it's essentially shot for shot a remake of the exact same movie. And the reason he made it in 2007 was because the world had once again gotten, so depraved in the world of horror that he needed to bring the message back by remaking the movie where he tried to criticize horror films, but actually became a super famous horror film. And then he remade it. This is Funny Games from 2007. Okay, so now we're gonna go to the 2000s. Now the year 2000 itself was a pretty noteworthy year for meta horror. And there were 3, by my count, that are very effective horror films. Urban Legends Final Cut, sequel to Urban Legends from 1998, which was sort of a meta film that was aware of itself, but Urban Legends Final Cut really takes it to the next level, where it's at a film school and there's like a film class where they're kind of working on projects and they're getting murdered. So they're very aware of filmmaking because the whole movie's about filmmaking. It's pretty good. It's very underrated. Another underrated horror slasher meta film from the year 2000 was Cherry Falls, starring Brittany Murphy. This movie is really a very strong commentary on the tropes of slasher movies, particularly when it comes down to the characters that have sex or don't have sex. That's what this whole movie is about, is the kind of act of sexuality in slasher films. But it's very clever and it's really entertaining as well. I love that one. Okay, and our third meta horror film from 2000, this is actually movie number 3 that we're going to be watching. This movie is called Shadow of the Vampire, starring Willem Dafoe as F.W. Murnau, director of the classic horror film Nosferatu, and Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck, the actor who plays Nosferatu in the movie. The movie premise is they're making Nosferatu. That's what the movie's about, the making of Nosferatu. The actor playing a vampire is actually a vampire. So as they move along making their film, he starts drinking the blood of other crew members. And Willem Dafoe is phenomenal as Max Schreck, the vampire Max Schreck. In fact, he was nominated for an Academy Award for supporting actor. And he was, I think, a front runner, but Benicio del Toro won for Traffic that year. He was sort of unbeatable, but Willem Dafoe was really fantastic in Shadow of the Vampire. That's going to be movie number 3. The 2000s were also where they kicked off Scary Movie, which is not a horror film, right? But I guess you can argue it's like a horror comedy, but definitely uses all the tropes of horror films and is a meta film that's aware of all of it. So was Club Dread from 2004. These types of movies, I'm not going to spend much time talking about those, but they might be worth mentioning. Okay, 2004 also gave us, I would argue, the most famous meta horror film since Scream. I'm not watching this one because you don't need this one for my recommendation. You've all seen it and you can go watch it if you want to, but this is not one of our 4 tonight. But Shaun of the Dead. This movie sends up kind of every trope of the zombie genre, but with such love and such an awareness of the films and what makes the films effective and great. It's brilliant, it's hilarious, it's scary, and it's pretty, tugs the heartstrings as well. It's a really great movie. I actually saw this with my friends Ryan and Sarah. We were in England and it was like a year before it came out in America, and I had no idea what the movie was. We were just walking around, and we kept seeing posters for, Shaun of the Dead, a romantic comedy with zombies. And I was like, we should go see that. I love zombies. I love horror comedies. And after a few days, we finally relented and then went and saw Shaun of the Dead. And it was like revelatory, because when you go into a movie that turns out to be a really phenomenal movie, but you have no preconceived notions of the film, it's like, holy shit, this movie's amazing. So I went back to America when our trip was over, and I was telling everyone about this movie. Oh my gosh, this movie was so great, blah, blah, blah. And then the next year it came out, or a few months later it came out in America, and then everybody went and saw it. And then, people are like, have you seen Shaun of the Dead? And it's like, yeah. Feast was the next year, 2005. It's a siege movie with monsters, and it uses a lot of the tropes that you see, like, the badass hero who's here to save your ass, and then he's dead like seconds later. And it introduces all the characters by the stereotypical roles that they play in horror movies like this. But this was John Gulager, and he was the winner of the 3rd season of Project Greenlight. And this was the movie that came out of the 3rd season. And this was arguably the only good movie that has come from the show Project Greenlight. They've had like 4 seasons now. And this is the only movie that I would argue is legitimately a good film, but this one's a lot of fun. I really love Feast. 2006 gave us a very noteworthy meta horror film called Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Behind the Mask is about a world where, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers actually exist, right? They're not movies, they're reality, they're real news stories. And this guy, Leslie Vernon, wants to be the next big slasher killer. So it's a mockumentary where like a documentary crew is following him around, and he's kind of giving them the ins and outs of what it takes to be a serial killer and to plan a big massacre. And so you see every step of how he's going to accomplish his big night of murdering a group of teens in a step-by-step process. And it's very fascinating and interesting how they do it. And for about an hour, the movie's absolutely brilliant. And then in the final act, they drop the documentary gimmick entirely and just make it like a normal cinematic film. And it's just not as good, because the documentary aesthetic works for like a low-budget horror film, which it is. But then when you try to give the look of having like a lot of money for your big expensive horror film, it just doesn't really work as well. But there's about a really brilliant hour of this movie, and it's pretty clever. Baghead came out in 2008 from the Duplass brothers. This is about a few actors who decide they're going to go up to the woods in Big Bear, and they're going to write their own movie to star in. And they're discussing horror films and what really scares people. They decide on like someone with a bag on their head. It's like the scariest thing you can see. And then someone with a bag on their head shows up, and they don't know if it's one of the 4 of them, or they don't know if there's actually like a crazy person. It's really low budget filmmaking, and this is mumblecore, but it's got amazing performances, including Greta Gerwig. Okay, 2009, Zombieland, sort of a knockoff version of Shaun of the Dead. It was okay. It was pretty popular. A lot of people liked it. Woody Harrelson is, of course, very charming. And then it had a sequel like a couple years ago that was just dreadful. Okay, 2010 has like a trifecta of meta horror films that verge from terrible to really brilliant. Let's start with the really brilliant. Tucker and Dale versus Evil. This movie is so funny. This is like a backwoods redneck horror film, and it's all from the perspective of the redneck killers, but they're actually just 2 kind of lovable idiot rednecks that live out in the woods, and a group of teens assumes that these 2 men are out to murder all of them, and the teens, through fault of their own, keep getting killed off one by one, and it looks like the rednecks are the ones that are doing it. That sounds ridiculous, and that sounds like maybe the idea for a short film or a sketch, and it's not going to sustain itself as an entire feature, but it absolutely does, and it stays brilliant the entire time. It's really, really funny. The director of this would go on to do another kind of send-up of a horror genre, Little Evil, that came out on Netflix. Highly don't recommend that one. That one's truly dreadful, but Tucker and Dale versus Evil is a really brilliant horror comedy. I love that movie. 2010 also gave us Human Centipede 2, which is a really, really disgusting movie. One of the movies that ended date night with me and Gina one night faster than any other movie has before. This movie is taking the concept of the human centipede, where there's this mad scientist who, stitches 3 people together ass to mouth, right? So you're going to feed one centipede, and they're going to shit down the second centipede and then they're going to shit into the third, and the third is like shitting out the shit of both of them. So it's really disgusting. But Tom Six made the Human Centipede, and the tagline was 100% medically accurate. So it wasn't really as exploitive and nasty as you would imagine, because he tried to go about it like a medical procedure that you would actually do. So Human Centipede 2, the tagline is 100% medically inaccurate. And the idea is there's a guy who's obsessed with the movie The Human Centipede who wants to go make his own Human Centipede, but he wants to do it with like, I don't know, like 20 people or 25 people or some shit like that. So it's this weird little guy who's like a very inept surgeon, and he's kidnapping people and taking them to this warehouse, and he's doing these really hack job surgeries to get them all into their Human Centipede. It's absolutely repulsive. It is off the wall crazy. I mean, it's just pure shock value. It's really funny with how extreme it goes, but it's also very, very vile. Like, Human Centipede is not as disgusting as you would think. The Human Centipede 2 is fully way more disgusting than you would anticipate. It also stars one of the actresses from The Human Centipede, but as herself. So he calls her to come have an audition for another movie. She thinks she's going to have an interview with like Quentin Tarantino, I think. And then he abducts her and makes her part of the Human Centipede chain. But it's a wild movie. But that was also 2010. 2010 also gave us Rubber, which is part fascinating and part heavy-handed. So Rubber is basically just about a sentient tire that stands itself up and starts rolling around, and it has like these mental abilities where like it can like shake, and then it'll like blow someone's head up, right? So it's like a evil killer tire that's rolling around the desert murdering people. But then they have a very heavy-handed commentary on horror films. So they have like an audience. So there's like a little group of people that are roped off that are like watching the movie as it unfolds in front of them, and like making commentary on the movie. So it's definitely a meta horror film, but one that tries a little too hard. 2011 gives us probably one of the best meta horror films ever made. In fact, so good and so smart that it effectively puts the final nail in the coffin of meta horror, because they don't ever get better than this. Now, this one is the exception to the filmmaking rule. Now, I said I wanted 4 movies where it's about filmmaking. This next movie is not directly about filmmaking, but this is a more astute commentary on horror films than any of the other previously mentioned meta horror films. It is, of course, Cabin in the Woods. The Cabin in the Woods was made like a year or 2 before it came out, and then the studio kind of shelved it because they didn't know what they had, and they didn't think people were going to be into this very weird movie that's commenting on horror films, but it's also a horror comedy. But this is basically an explanation for anything that you've seen in a horror film that's made you go, well, that's stupid, why is that happening? This movie explains all of it. So it's a really brilliant analysis of horror films and horror audiences and the people who make the horror films. It's really very clever, and this movie is also a masterclass in how to stick the landing. This movie has a really great premise and a setup, and it keeps getting more and more interesting. And where is it going to go? Where is it going to go? By the time it gets to the third act, this is a movie that delivers. This movie delivers more effectively than almost any film I've seen. The third act is just absolutely wild and brilliant. My only real issue is that the argument that they're making for horror films seems to be horror audiences are flawed and we should scrap the whole system and start over. I can't really tell you too much more without spoiling anything, but I think the argument that could be extrapolated from where the movie goes is a little bit flawed and a little bit patronizing of horror audiences. But I've had this conversation with people who don't think that's what the argument is, don't think that's what they're trying to say with the movie. I think The Cabin in the Woods is almost too clever for its own good. It's so entertaining, it's so smart, it's so clever that I feel there was, in the years after 2011, a bit of a backlash, a bit of a push away. Like, true horror fans don't think it's a great horror film. And granted, it's not a particularly scary horror film. It doesn't get under your skin, but it certainly makes you think. And I think it was so clever that there was a kind of a bit of a pushback against the movie, because it was like, you're not going to reinvent the whole genre. You're not really as smart as you think you are. I know everything about horror films, so I don't really like that. I mean, it's pretty good, but I don't like it quite as much as everyone else does, right? Kind of like a status symbol to not like something that's like super popular. But the movie was super popular for a reason, because it tapped into everyone that loves horror films and really examines why we love horror films. So Cabin in the Woods, that's going to be our fourth movie. So Cabin in the Woods was like the peak meta horror film, and I don't think they've gotten better since then. I'll talk about a couple more. The Editor came out in 2014. It's a send-up of giallo films, so essentially like Italian slasher films that were very popular in the 70s and 80s. This is a very accurate representation of those films. It's a Canadian film that's making fun of these Italian films, but it's really funny. It's really twisted and bizarre, but I like The Editor, even though a lot of people don't like that one. And then Final Girls from 2015. This one's pretty clever. It's cute. It's not as thought-provoking as a commentary on horror films as I think it tries to be, but it really brings in a lot of heart and emotion, which is not something you typically see in sort of a meta horror film. After 2015, I don't really think meta horror has expanded or gotten better than Cabin in the Woods, and I really doubt that it will. So I think it's just something we need to pull back from for a while, for a few years, until something comes out and really makes us think about horror films in a different way. Maybe it'll be Scream 5 that's in production right now. It probably won't be, but it might be. I like the whole Scream franchise. I'm a little nervous about that one because it's the first one without Wes Craven, but what are you going to do? Fans are clamoring for another Scream. Our four films that we're going to be watching for meta horror are Cat in the Brain by Lucio Fulci from 1990. I'm going to jump up to 1994 for Wes Craven's New Nightmare, probably my favorite meta horror film ever made. Then we're going to go to the very fun Shadow of the Vampire from 2000. Now, Shadow of the Vampire is what I settled on, but there was a few options that I thought were very solid as well. Of course, Shaun of the Dead and Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. All of those films have really great stuff in them and really great commentaries on the horror genre, but we're going to go with Shadow of the Vampire. And then, of course, The Cabin in the Woods, the meta horror film to end all meta horror films. I really love this one. I love all of these movies. I love meta horror films. I just love geeking out on horror, and I like watching movies where the characters are geeking out on horror as well, or the filmmakers are geeking out on horror, or there's references, or there's kind of visual motifs that call back previous horror films. I just love all that shit. So these are movies that I really just adore watching, and as much as I said there's not really a lot of really great meta horror films from the past 5 years, I still watch them all and, to one degree or another, get a kick out of them. But those are the four that we're going to be watching today for meta horror. I hope you hung on through all, 30 of those recommendations. But if you didn't, that's okay too. If you're still watching, I hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you're watching great movies, staying sane in a truly insane time. We got an election coming up, a really important election. You should go vote, and obviously you should wear a mask. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.